Radio Hope today. I did miss a day, but I just could not garner up the words to even try to introduce a dialogue about what is happening in the United States of America. Now, if there is one word that I could use in order to kind of encompass my experience of being an American and these realities of 2025, it is parody, because it's difficult to understand whether our whiskey secretary, so Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, who is the one at the head of this whiskey leaks, truly is inept, or whether he's just always drunk. But it's kind of difficult because sometimes something is so stupid where you just question, is this intentional or is this just intentionally meant to distract? Because how dumb do you have to be for someone within the staff of this government to basically leak out war plans to an not anti-Trump, but someone who has historically been critical of the administration, a journalist? Like, was that intentional? And if it was intentional, what would the intention be? What would that be distracting away from? But what it does give us is an opportunity to understand the most important aspects, which is one, the fact that they are actively trying to maintain communication in channels in which it can be self-destroyed, right? So they don't have a record of what is being said. This is illegal on multiple counts, but I'm not going to delve into that because, as we know here in the United States of America, the rule of law has a lot of leeway for interpretation if you are the administration in power, particularly the one who has compromised the branches, to redefine that the executive has lawmaking power and it has enforcing power and it has judicial power. So in that reality, it's really like beating on a dead horse to just throw around the words that it's illegal when it doesn't actually have any punishment or consequences. Now we see Donald Trump losing legal cases. However, the consequences of that have not happened. They're actually dragged on, right? Dragged on. And that's how it's going to be, because here in the United States of America, the problem is that our Constitution, checks and balances, the separation of powers is based on honor code. It's based on the honor code that each branch will be capable of holding up their own without being compromised. But what Mike Johnson, so the Speaker of the House, threatening the federal courts, saying that U.S. Congress has the power to stop funding a federal court and basically just shut it down, that tells us that there is a validity in something that I've been saying, which is the fact that, is there truly checks and balances if Congress is supposed to check the courts? The courts is supposed to check Congress. It's also supposed to check the executive. Congress is supposed to create lawmaking. So the courts check Congress, but Congress creates the laws that guide the courts because Article 3 of the Constitution is incomplete. So there is a interdependence between the courts and Congress. And now we see Mike Johnson bringing up the fact that the courts are now dependent on Congress to pass their funding. So that's further a relationship that has a conflict of interest, right? To where the courts can be influenced in going against their independence and going against the law and the Constitution because they need funding to function, right? And that's why Paul Weiss, the law firm, bent the knee, because they said they would be destroyed if Donald Trump actually went ahead and activated on his threats. So they would rather give him what he wants than sacrifice their own survival. And that's what we see happening when it comes to attorneys. The DOJ attorney who signed the Eric Adams case drop, he went against his constitutional oath to support it and went for his obedience to superior orders, that is the DOJ, that is the executive. So it makes us question, does the Constitution mean anything? Now, as we the people on the bottom, it does mean a lot, but what we are seeing is that the contract, which was between the government and the people, is being violated on the side of the government, and the branches are incapable of realigning them to actually promote the best interest of what is supposed to be done within our constitutional republic, because the Senate allowing for Donald Trump to not be impeached due to their own technicalities of, hey, he's technically not president right now, that means that they allowed for him to subvert the constitutional supremacy, because the executive is not supreme to the Constitution, nor is the legislative, nor is the judiciary, nor is democracy, nor is you, nor is me, nor is the people. The social contract is a contract. When you sign a contract, it is a contract that binds you to another party. When that is violated, you get whatever it is in the provision that is required in order to solve the rectification. Now, when it comes to our own constitution, there is enough ambiguity in Amendment 14, Section 3, which disqualifies someone who has invoked or comforted an insurrection from being in office. There's so much uncertainty with the wordings and who is capable of authorizing it or invoking it, that it's basically not useful for Congress to even try to make an effort to use it. So we're in a reality where that provision is silent, but it doesn't change the fact that it exists. If the courts, through Trump versus Anderson, said that Congress requires the legislation to remove him from the ballot, but the provision itself says that Congress has to vote by majority to remove him from counting under the provision, and neither vote has occurred, why is he in the White House? Why is he in the White House? And that's because it is honor code that is based on people actually doing their job. But when their job is so upfront and the reality to where lawmakers, so Congress, is supposed to make laws. So they're not supposed to interpret laws or try to challenge the interpretation of laws, because that's not their job, right? That's how they restricted their job duties to be. They're not defenders of the Constitution. They're just lawmakers, right? They're not there to do the dirty work of the people. It is the people who have to shed the blood. It isn't the politicians. That's why the Democrats are scared for their lives, right? They don't care that it's the constitutional republic that will end if they're alive. It doesn't matter, because their job security is more important than our social security, right? That's why they fail to actually have a backbone. That's why Chuck Schumer bent the knee, because they benefit from upholding the status quo. I criticize here the Democratic Party, but I'm not reckless. So we have to keep voting Democrats, and we can at the same time simultaneously create a party that will hopefully replace them. However, until that is a viable reality, we have no other choice but to promote this party, to promote what's progressive, right? So don't assume that me criticizing it means that I'm abandoning it. I am outside of the party right now because after the swearing, I was like, I'm done with this, but I know I'm gonna have to go back. But ultimately, it's a stance that I chose to take because right now nothing's happening in California, so it's not like I need to vote. I mean, technically, being transgender, maybe I cannot vote because I cannot even get a passport. My legal documents say that my gender, so male, but if they wanted to be the original one, then it's obviously going to be misaligned to my birth certificate that does say male, which is legally changed. So in that reality, I guess we'll have to see about that. But ultimately, I'm very realistic, I'm very objective. So even though I'm critical and very cautious of not glorifying the Democrats for doing the bare minimum, I also know that we also cannot afford to allow for conservatives to have takeovers throughout the country. But in vocalizing the affirmation of the criticisms, hopefully it's capable of containing the critics into our side and giving some hope as to the reality that even if we have to struggle with choosing or tolerating people who don't have a backbone, that hopefully that will empower us, that anger will empower us to create those channels, to create those candidates, to push those candidates, to garner those grassroots candidates who will challenge the incumbents for the 2026 House elections. And in that reality, we can truly take over the party, we can truly take over Congress, but that has to be done right now at the grassroots level, because the problem is that the Democratic Party is full of people who are upheld to the political status quo. Now, it's not enough for individuals like AOC, Bernie Sanders, and Jasmine Crockett, because we cannot put the weight of the party on them. It has to be a collective, and the unit has failed. It's not the team members, it is the coach, right? And because of that, it has failed to actually maintain its membership. It has actually lost trust, it's lost confidence, and the people just don't show up because they don't feel like they are part of the civic process. They don't feel like their vote actually matters. And when we can be critical, it's important to understand that it is up for the party to convince people to go out and vote, and not necessarily up to the voter to compromise and say, I need to vote because I need to vote. It should be the parties who really appeal to the people. But if the whole argument is vote blue no matter who, or lesser two evils, that's not really appealing. Of course, I went out and I voted. I voted for Kamala Harris. I voted for Hillary Clinton. I voted for Joe Biden, and I'm a Joe Biden critic. But this is to say that you don't have to like the candidate 1,000%. You just have to acknowledge that they're capable of being a messenger for what you need. And if the other candidate is worse for what you need, then that candidate, it's better to have that candidate. Now, while we can build up to better narratives within the United States to create a much more ideal country, we cannot do that until we actually challenge those channels, right? So I cannot just criticize Kamala Harris for not meeting XYZ when in fact that's the narrative that she has inherited through a traditional of politics, right? So the reality that we are quote unquote pro-Israel as a country or pro-Zionist as a country is because we have a strategic interest in the region. We have an interest in the region that Israel is surrounded by, so Palestine belonging to Israel. Why? Because it's better for Palestine to belong to Israel than for Palestine to belong to Iran. And even Palestine belonging to Palestine for the United States means that Palestine belongs to Iran. So there is a territorial conquest that is required, and that's something that has been promoted from a bipartisan level. That is why the whole kidnapping of protesters, the whole kidnapping of legal residents, the whole kidnapping of people for writing op-eds, that's something that was fed off the Joe Biden policy. And again, I'm not saying that Kamala Harris would have been worse. I think actually coming from an international law background, I would say that after a win, Kamala Harris would have calmed down on the Gaza policy. She was an employee of the Biden administration and she had an ethical attachment to his narrative. So while it can be criticized, I can see why she wasn't as challenging to his policy. And I think that's issue of professional ethics where she was thinking much more of a lawyer, where lawyers uphold the obedience to superior orders. That would be Joe Biden. So I don't necessarily blame her because people expected her and Joe Biden to call it a genocide, but ultimately not even the ICC has prosecuted Netanyahu for genocide, but for war crimes, because genocide, coming from an international law background, requires a measurement that doesn't currently exist. So it requires a consensus where people can actually have a measurable method of what it means, right? So whatever that means to today's international scholars, international lawyers, is currently not very clear because they're not allowing for people to go into Gaza and actually investigate, right? So in our reality, it's kind of difficult to pinpoint the intent. And I know you're like, it's obvious. I know, as an international law background, conflict scholar, I accept that there is genocide happening in Gaza, right? However, as attorneys, you can only advocate for the evidence that is in front of you. I'm not an attorney. I don't have a JD, but I have a non-lawyer legal jurisdiction background, and you need that evidence. If I go to court and I tell the judge, if he asks me what color is the sky, and I say the sky is blue, and he asks me, well, can you prove it? And I say, well, look in the sky, it's blue. It's literally blue. Look, it's common sense that it's blue, but I have to prove that it's blue, and I don't have to like it in order to understand that that's a process that has to be achieved in order for something to be promoted as truth, right? As lawful. And the fact that that has not occurred in regards to categorizing it as a genocide on an official level means that they have some leeway to not call it a genocide, right? Again, I'm not agreeing that it's not a genocide, but I'm saying I can understand why they wouldn't have a duty to call it a genocide when not even the legal professionals are capable of calling it as such. And this may be difficult to understand, but let's use this example. Let's say I just woke up. This isn't a true story, but a bunch of my neighbors are of Asian descent, right? Let's say I'm white. I just woke up and a bunch of my neighbors end up not alive, and all of the evidence points to the fact that I did it. Now the question becomes intent. Is it the fact that I committed the act because of their demographic? So is it a hate crime, Or is it the fact that I just wake up? Maybe I'm having some sort of crisis, and it just so happened to be that I was going to do it no matter what the demographic it was. It was just the fact that they were my neighbors. So if it just happens because of an act of violence, then that's bad, but it's not as severe as if I did it because of the demographic, right? So there is a clear intent and genocide. And while people who know the history, like me, I've been active in the past in the pro-Palestine movement, and I've engaged in the rhetoric of the whole Israel-Palestine conflict, and I taken a class literally on the Israeli state taught by a self-proclaimed Zionist, where the majority of the class identified as Zionists. So I've given time and effort and openness to both sides. So truly, I do understand this. So from a personal level, no doubt there is a genocide, there is apartheid. Even the international community agrees that there is apartheid in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. But on a legal level, when it comes to genocide, it's unclear in Gaza. So I understand why they would have to be so nonchalant about that. And I think they need to do a better job at vocalizing why it is that the government takes the positions that it does. And the truth is truly that the government has misinterpreted its role to be savior of the interests of the United States, but through the perspective of the government. So the government gets to decide whether the goal of the government is for national security. And when I think national security, I mean domestic security. That's what I would presume would be the most important thing, because what's the point of having eyes on the foreign governments, on the foreign countries, when you don't have eyes on the United States? Now, when you have eyes on the foreign government, you don't pay attention to your country. That's why September 11 was successful. Honestly, literally 4 planes hijacked, and there's conspiracies to it, right? But what it tells us is that we spend so much money on defense for what? For what? We couldn't use it at home to defend ourselves, and we saw that during the insurrection, January 6th, and we see that now. We see that now because Joint Chiefs of Staff, they have the capability of restoring the Constitution if there is a constitutional crisis, but that's ambiguous, right? Like, what does that mean? Exactly when do you reach that point? I would have thought they reached the point when he removed 2 of them for being black and being a woman, but apparently that's not it. So ultimately, what we have is an honor code where people have interpretation of their own duties without actual force compliance to the constitutional mandate that they actually took an oath to uphold, because that constitutional mandate is pretty unclear as well. Because even when we look at let's say the crime against treason, the crime against overturning a government, when we look at that in an academic level, especially here in the United States, if Article 6 of Pharmacy Clause assures that the Constitution is the law of the land and not even the government itself can subvert the Constitution, then why is it that the crime is against the government and not against the Constitution? It would be more severe for one to subvert and be against the Constitution that it would be to be against the government. Now, the problem with January 6th was that it wasn't against the government, it was against the Constitution. So it was a constitutional process that was trying to be delayed, that was trying to be changed, right? But disagreeing with the government itself shouldn't be an offense that makes you a traitor. It is attacking the United States Constitution. Now, the fact that we allowed for someone who attacked the Constitution to be on the ballot, now that brings us to the judicial coup, right? The judicial coup where the conservative judges who should have been impartial, should have been independent, because our judges, it shouldn't matter whether they're much more right or left leaning. They should be in obedience to the law and the Constitution, primarily when you're in a high court, the Supreme Court, to the Constitution. But they chose a duty to the political agenda, right? To the political and religious agenda, when the Constitution itself is our mandate, not a religious text. So they're already promoting the politicization of external voices to that of their main duty. And the whole reason why they have a lifetime appointment is because they are expected to align to the United States Constitution and not be politicized. But when they are politicized, then they shouldn't deserve to have their for life role, because they're ultimately usurping the United States Constitution through that role, because they know that they won't be removed, because we don't have a removal clause. Alexander Hamilton promoted in Federalist 78 through 83 that a removal clause would make a judge less likely to do their job well because they would be too paranoid about being removed. And that's really what allowed for them to give him the immunity, right? Because a president who thinks they will be prosecuted won't want to leave office. So instead of solving the fact that a president shouldn't have a choice but to leave office if he lost, they said that we're going to allow for them to be immune because we're going to give them a prize because otherwise they would just be bad actors, which is a wild argument, but it's the argument that Alexander Hamilton promoted in saying that if we didn't give judges life appointments, if we had a removal clause, it would make them not do their job right and it would make them into bad judges. But we see that that's not true. That has no weight. That is a difference between originalism, which is the opinions of our founding fathers, those who wrote the laws, and of the lawmakers themselves, the policymakers, their intentions. But ultimately, we shouldn't be focused on their intentions, but constitutionalism, which is the contract. In no other reality can you say, hey, I read the contract, but I didn't actually mean to sign it if I knew this was there. No, you'll still be forced to abide by that contract. So the reality that a voice outside of the Constitution can actually subvert the Constitution is wild and is forbidden between Federalist 78 through 83. But we go back to the reality that because Congress creates the laws that binds the courts and the courts depend on Congress to give them money, there is an interdependence and there is a reality in which our branches are paralyzed and are incapable of actually upholding the rule of law and upholding the Constitution. That's what we're going to see. That's what we're going to see because I see no one being held accountable for WikiLeaks, right? They're going to try to minimize the impact. They're going to try to minimize the fact that it was a severe breach. They're going to say that it was a mistake. But even if it was a mistake that they invited him in, why are they having that conversation on Signal? Why are they putting it to be deleted after a week? Why are they doing it while they are in Russia? Why are they doing it in unsafe, insecure devices? Why is this occurring? And nothing will be done because those who are supposed to investigate and enforce the laws are the ones who want them to do it, right? The problem isn't that they were using Signal, at least not for the executive. The problem was that they were caught. So the reality is that they're going to actively continue to do these type of tricks in order to be capable of hiding from history what they were actually saying. Because they know that once it comes down, that what is documented will be the ones that will be used for their prosecution, right? So the rule of law is in a crisis. We've already been in a constitutional crisis. So I really dislike when our democratic leaders, our legal analysts, political analysts position that we're not in a constitutional crisis yet and that it will come. We're already in it. You just keep moving the goalposts because you don't want to admit that your industry, so whether law, whether politics, whether government, isn't actually working and has failed to actually serve the interests of what they were supposed to uphold, which is the Constitution. Now, what lawmakers would promote is that, hey, technically, they're meant to support the Constitution, not defend the Constitution. There's a difference. You see how they go to technicalities and say, well, technically, I'm not supposed to give my life for this country. I'm just a lawmaker. I wasn't elected to sacrifice my life. Do you see how we have cowards in Congress? This is the Congress that is the weakest in its history because it actually is responsible for the fall of our democracy. And while I know that we will restore it, it is important to acknowledge that this Congress has failed to exist as electors of the people. They have failed to fight for the people. They have failed and have done the bare minimum. And this has to tell us that in whatever we do after, we have to clarify. We have to clarify. And while I do not recommend us invoking Article 5 right now because we require a Congress who is actually capable of disallowing the convention from going back to the state legislature, I would say that it would have to continue and to the convention of the states. And I don't trust our current Congress, even with the Democrats, to do that. It means that we require clarification within our constitutional mandate, but also in laws. The fact that voter suppression laws are basically legal because the legislature hasn't agreed to even make it illegal because red states benefit from it. Now that should be something that shouldn't even be allowed, shouldn't even be real. But the reality is that that's why they want to promote state rights above federal authority, because federal authority is what's supposed to make sure that the states do not encroach on personal rights, right? The states are not allowed to do certain things to their citizens that are contrary to the United States Constitution. We know that because of Federalist 78 through 83. Unless it changes through Article 5, which is why the Republicans want the Convention of the States. So there's a website that they have, and they're lobbying, I believe, 13 states. One of them is New Jersey, in order to invoke Article 5. Do not do that. I know it's very, very much something that a lot of progressives probably want and agree that we need, but this is not the convention that we want. This is not the proposal that we want, and I've been advocating for it, but we have to wait on it, at least until we have a US Congress that can actually have a backbone to promote what we need from a convention. So we have to sit on that, but we cannot allow for them, because their greatest goal isn't to fix the Constitution. It's always been to replace the Constitution. That's why they want to move us back to the Articles of Confederation. That is what they want, because what do they want to remove? Federal authority, which is funny because they want to increase state authority, right? State rights. But at the same time, they're enlarging the federal authority through the invocation of executive orders as lawmaking, which in itself does the opposite of what they said they were going to do. But the reality is that they want red states to reign. That's why, because they don't care about California state rights. They don't care about the fact that California is over 40% Latino, the fact that the majority of the state is diverse, the fact that we speak Spanish in the state because we became a state in 1850. Before that, we were Mexico. Before that, we were Spain. We've always been native. So the reality that they only want their white colonial statehood to dominate the United States of American culture says a lot about their commitment to state rights. That's just a commitment to white supremacy and a commitment to fascist regime. And we have to acknowledge it for what it is. Pete Hegseth won't be held accountable, at least not immediately, but we can pressure it. Now, I am certain that they may be pressured to sacrifice one or a few in order to kind of settle it. But ultimately, we have to acknowledge that they're going to continue doing dirty tricks in order to not get caught, because they know that this will see their times in prison. And they don't want to do that, which is why they disappear the messages, right? This is why. But Russia already has it, so what's the point? But we have to acknowledge all of this and accept that we have to continue pressuring, even if it seems helpless, because ultimately they will only create action from us pressuring them, from us creating that turmoil inside, from us selling our Tesla stocks, from us ensuring that they implode on each other. Now that is how we get through them. We don't allow them to breathe. We go and pressure every single weak spot. We do it simultaneously. We do it, and they're eventually going to explode. They're eventually going to explode because we're going to pressure. We're going to pressure, when we, the people, as numbers, we will make that difference, calling them, doing all of these things, going to town halls. Now, we both know what it's ultimately going to require, right? But ultimately, until we get there, we have to continue that pressure. We have to continue it, because otherwise they won't listen. Otherwise, they will allow themselves to just nonchalantly eliminate every single thing that has been granted to us through our 1789 ratification of the United States Constitution, and the continued resistance of Americans throughout generations, whether that's of the labor workers in Appalachia, of the civil rights movement, of the Chicano rights movement, of Stonewall. It has been a group effort across the divides of racial and identity politics that has created an America that has been relatively united up until now. Now that he is very much eliminating a lot of that protections, it has to be acknowledged that this utopia that the white dominant society and conservative society has, that an absence of race, an absence of difference equals equality, is not true, because their interpretation of what that absence or default is not different. It's white, and that's white supremacy. You see, you cannot erase cultures, you cannot erase a difference, and you can have difference included. And even the Constitution, someone told me that we should just ignore, like, not have gender included or any race mentions in the Constitution. And that's literally how it was originally intended. That's why they didn't want the Bill of Rights to be included, because they said, well, it's already common knowledge that we have freedom of speech. But today, they're getting kidnapped for freedom of speech. So obviously, we need to expand it and make it very clear. We need to expand it and make it very clear that women exist, that gender exists. And by gender, I mean the fact that you shouldn't be capable of violating a gender because you see it as less than, right? You shouldn't be violating people because you do not accept their existence. And that's the type of America that we need to promote, an America that is inclusive, that exists within a coloring box, and where we are all different, but we all contribute to the same unit. And that's how we've been existing, even though it doesn't seem like it. And there's a reality of where we're told to be very exclusive and very isolated from each other. But truly, when you look at the United States from outside, like I lived in England for over 3 years, there are characteristics that binds us together across those differences. And I didn't realize that until I was living in England and I went to a women's World Cup game in Paris. And I went and it was, no offense, Paris, wasn't a good time. It was a great time, but it really wasn't. If you go to Paris, you'll understand. The point is, after not seeing Americans for a long time, like I saw Americans, but it wasn't really. I felt at home. I felt included. Like color didn't matter. Like we were all in a place where we didn't know the language. We were all heading the same way. We were all chatting. Didn't really matter. We were all there to see the girls beat a country, and that's all we wanted to see. Our flag thrive, and it wasn't my flag, it wasn't their flag, it was our flag, different colors. We all had the same flag. And it made me realize that, hey, I'm included in this country too. And it's wild because I was literally born in the United States, but when you grew up being asked, where are you from? And it's like, I'm from here, LA, I'm from here, California. And they're like, no, where are you really from? I've never even been to Mexico, right? So that shows us that there is things that bind us, but it is in the best interest of those in politics here to keep us separate. And until we remove that separation that was manipulated and artificial, until then is when we're capable of truly accepting that the identity of America is diverse, and that diverse does include those who feel excluded from it. So like white people, they're included in diversity too. Appalachia, the whole history of exploitation. When it comes to equity, when it comes to inclusion, it also includes that. It includes accommodating for a Southern accent to not equate to you being stupid. It's accepting that there's diversity in our existence and that it shouldn't be a disadvantage, right? And until we realize that that fight is artificial, until we realize that it is the political elite who are trying to reshape and redefine what the American government is so that they can benefit and concentrate the power and the wealth for themselves and their friends versus the people, until then, we will find it difficult to come together and fight for this country. We need to come together and fight for this country. And that starts with pressuring. Even if you don't believe that anything will be achieved, you need to continue pressuring because we can get someone fired. We can get someone fired for what happened. And succeeding even with one, that is the goal, because we need to break them little by little, and we need to take every single opportunity they give us. And whether or not it was intentional, the leak, what it shows is that they're inept. What it shows is that they're actively doing things in order to not get caught, and that's ultimately going to help in putting them away. So we need to ensure that they get reckless. We need to put that pressure so they're reckless. So you need to accept that whatever criticisms you may have, there is work to do, and take your time. You need to rest too, but ultimately we need to be the force, because ultimately South Korea didn't impeach the president the first time, but the people were like, no, you're going to do it again. And they did it. So ultimately we have to regain that power. And I advocate no tyrant government has ever fallen without a protest. And I put it on my TikTok. I acknowledge and affirm the fact that Black Americans and more darker skinned Americans at a protest exist to the authorities as target practice. So their skin in general is a weapon. So it is on those who are lighter skin, on those who are white. 250 million Americans are consider themselves to categorize as white. And this means that we can achieve 11, 12 million people who are needed for a mass protest within this group. And that's even me, including myself as a Latino who isn't actually super white. So the reality is that protests will be required, but it needs to be people who have the privileges to be capable of navigating against the threat of armed forces or the cops in a way that's much safer than if it was just, people who the cops automatically saw as not American, who automatically saw as criminals. So that's where people need to step up in order to mitigate the risk to Americans who have historically been disenfranchised and have historically been seen as subhuman. So that's where those with privilege, those who are deemed as the ideal family unit, so like white, right, like blonde, those are the ones who have to come together and truly as a unit challenge this agenda, challenge this regime. Because yes, they're going to invoke martial law. That's going to happen no matter what. However, we have to do it in a way where it's controlled. And that means that we're not using violence, right? What we're doing is we're invoking it in a way to where they do that misstep of invoking it against a very legal constitutional reaction, right? So whether that's us standing, whether that's us dancing, whether that's us having a party, because ultimately they're going to say, well, this person was standing in a place that wasn't allowed in a permit, right? They're going to use whatever excuse, but ultimately it has to be in a way to where when they do it, it's going to make a sound across borders because it's done in a way that is against human rights, that is against civil rights, that is against constitutional rights, that is against how a government should deal with its people who are using their freedom to petition, freedom to protest, right? And we need that in order for other governments to be much more forceful in how they negotiate and have a relationship with the United States. And we have to do this because the alternative is to do nothing. And that means that we live in a tyranny forever. So ultimately, it's either you're going to die on your feet or you're going to live on your knees. What is your choice? Because I've made my choice.